The first principle of Kingian Nonviolence is nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. And it speaks to the idea that nonviolence is not a passive thing, that it's a proactive thing. I think a lot of us have seen fights break out in our own communities, and oftentimes you'll see a group of people just gather around to watch. Those people who are just gathering around to watch are being not violent, right? I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about nonviolence is all it means to be nonviolent is to be not violent. But all those people who gather around and watch the violence in our communities and don't do anything about it, they're being not violent. So Dr. King, the way he understood nonviolence was it wasn't just about not being violent, but it was about taking a stand against violence. And when you live in a community and in a society that is so filled with violence, it takes incredible courage to be the one to stand up and call for peace. And you watch videos and footage from the civil rights movement, and you see all those students and all those young people go out into the streets knowing that they might get beaten, knowing that they might get hosed, knowing that they might get bitten by dogs, and going out there anyways. That's what it means to be nonviolent, and that takes an incredible amount of courage. So that's the first principle that we always talk about, is that nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. It's not just a tactic, but it's a way of life, and it's how we interact with the world, and making a commitment to always take a stand against violence, to always take a stand against injustice. Principle number 2 is the beloved community is the framework of the future. The beloved community is the idea, is the vision for the society that Dr. King was working towards. And it's a society that includes justice for all people. So in that context, even the framing of the Occupy movement about the 99% and the 1%, as brilliant as that framing was because it brought so many people and so many communities and so many issues together, ultimately I don't think it's a framing that Dr. King would have supported, because Dr. King's vision of the beloved community included 100% of humanity. Dr. King always said about segregation that segregation wasn't an issue between black people and white people, but it was an issue between justice and injustice. And similarly, the issues that the Occupy movement was trying to address is not an issue between the 99% and the 1%, but it's an issue between what's right and what's wrong. And so what we're trying to do is create a community, the beloved community, that includes equitable relationships between all people, where we haven't defeated our opponent, but we won our opponent over. And it's a framework for the future because Dr. King understood that, again, that vision of the beloved community isn't something that's going to happen overnight, but it's something that we needed to be committed to in a long-term way. And that concept of the beloved community, sometimes people describe it as Dr. King's vision of utopia. And utopia isn't something that we're ever going to be able to create, right? We're never going to be able to live in a world that's entirely free of violence. But if we don't aim for that, we're definitely not going to get anywhere close to it. So as absurd as it is to envision a world without violence, if that's our beloved community, if that's the vision of the society that we're trying to create, that will ensure that we'll get as close to it as possible. So to me, whether that vision that you have for the society that you want to create is possible or not, whether it's realistic or not, this principle talks about the need to dream big so that we can get as close to that vision as we can in our lifetime. The third principle of Kingian nonviolence is attack forces of evil and not persons doing evil. This is one of the most challenging principles, I think, to practice in our own lives and in our movements, because we're so used to attacking people and we're so used to attacking individuals. During the Oscar Grant movement, we attacked Johannes Messerle as if he was the problem. During George Bush's presidency, we attacked him as if he was the problem. But recognizing that there's always a history to those conflicts and that there's always systemic reasons of why these people do what they do. Essentially, Johannes Messerle did what he was trained to do. George Bush did what he was trained to do. There's reasons why we continue to have police brutality and why we continue to have politicians that aren't fighting for the people. And it's because there's systemic issues behind that. And so Dr. King was always good at recognizing the root causes of a conflict and not attacking the people, but attacking those sources, attacking the root problems or the root causes of the problems. And so that's what this principle speaks to, is being able to identify why things are the way they are and not just looking at the symptoms of the problem, but really addressing the root causes of the problems in our society. Principle number 4 is accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve a goal. This applies in any, whether it's social movements or interpersonally. Anyone who's ever played a sport understands the importance of this principle. that if your goal is to become the best athlete that you can be, then you're going to need to voluntarily accept a lot of suffering in order to get there. If your goal is to go to college, you might have to skip out on some parties and sit home and do homework, and that creates some suffering. It's not easy, but recognizing that if you have a goal in mind, that volunteering yourself for some sacrifice, for some suffering, can be redemptive and it can help you grow. And also recognizing that voluntarily accepting that suffering in the context of social movements, again, it paints a very clear picture of who's right and who's wrong. When you're facing police violence and state repression, when you're able to maintain those values that you want to see reflected in the society that we're trying to create, it paints a very clear picture of who's on the side of justice, who's on the right side of justice, and who's on the side of injustice. And so it's a really important principle both in our own personal lives as well as in social movements. The fifth principle of Kingian nonviolence is avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external physical violence. Oftentimes in our society, we think of violence as just a physical act, and we fail to recognize that there's twice as many suicides in this country every year as there are homicides. And I would even argue that a lot of those homicides, if not all of them, are ultimately rooted in internal violence. People sometimes say, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And it's one of the biggest lies in the world. A lot of times the things that we hear and the things that we take in when we're kids, those scars and those wounds stay with us well into our adulthood. And I think it's really important that we recognize violence as not just a physical act, but it's about how we treat each other, about how we speak to each other. You look at incidents like the school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, and all these mass shootings. These shooters were dealing with an incredible amount of internal violence of the spirit. And that manifested in those physical acts of violence. And so if we're only defining violence as a physical act, we're missing out on a lot of the root causes of the violence. Dr. King also said that nonviolence isn't just a refusal to shoot your opponent, it's a refusal to hate your opponent, because holding on to that hate and holding on to that anger is an act of violence that you do to yourself. So committing yourself to nonviolence isn't just refusing to hurt someone physically, but it's refusing to harbor that sort of hate and refusing to harbor that sort of anger, because all that does is it hurts you. It keeps you from being able to move on, and it's an act of violence that you do to yourself. So that internal violence of the spirit is just as important as those physical acts of violence for us to deal with. The sixth and final principle of Kingian nonviolence is that the universe is on the side of justice. This, of course, is another principle that a lot of people struggle with, because there's so much injustice in our society, there's so much violence in our society. People say, well, how can you tell me that the universe is on the side of justice? Dr. King, as a minister, I think had a deep faith in this principle. And not just as a Christian, as a minister, but I think ultimately anyone who's ever been involved in any sort of process for social change has faith in this principle. Otherwise, why would they do it? Everyone who ever participated in the march in the civil rights movement knew that as hard as it is, as difficult as it was, as difficult as their current situation was, that if they kept fighting, that if they kept marching, that ultimately they will win justice. And I think once we lose faith in that, it can lead to a lot of internal violence and a sense of desperation and hopelessness, and that's a very dangerous thing for movements. So I think for anyone involved in social change movements, it's really important for us to continue to have faith in this principle. I also think at the same time that the violence we see in our communities, I've come to believe that the violence in our communities is evidence of this principle. And what I mean by that is, look at all of the investments that we make into violence as a society. Investing in a corrupt police force, investing in broken schools, broken prison systems, unjust economic policies. And then we're somehow surprised that we see violence in our communities. I think we get out of life what we put into life, right? And as a society, if we continue to invest in violence, then the justice of the universe will ensure that the returns that we get on those investments is more violence and injustice. And if we can start to invest more in peace, I believe that the justice in the universe will reward us with those returns, which would be more peace and more justice for communities. So the universe is on the side of justice. It's about what we put in and about the faith that we have in the work that we do.